Hello. So this video is going to go through some really sort of introductory basics to visibility setting and graphics and views, and just some tips and tricks on getting things set up and getting up and running. This can easily be a 2 hour long video. There's so much in Revit that revolves around view settings and graphics, but this is just kind of gonna trying to keep this video length to be kind of like a bite-sized introduction so that you can get up and running pretty quick. And then I'll make note of some of the things that I'm not really going to be covering that are worth kind of looking into once you get a little bit more comfortable and are getting into a larger kind of project. All right, so I guess I'll just jump right in. This is the Libra House building that we've been using throughout the class demos. Um, and so I'm actually going to start in a plan view. So the basic sort of the any view, the main interface for interfacing with the graphics is going to be this visibility and graphics um, overrides button here. And so you can access it here, or usually what I do, since I use this one a lot, is I'll have a quick key. So the quick key is VG, or VV actually works also. Um, so I'll just pull that up, and you see here that we have all of our basically Revit categories and some associated visibility settings here. So, and then there's a few other tabs up here. So annotation categories. So once we get into more symbols and annotations, this is also something that would be relevant. We're going to stick mostly with model categories for this video. And there's a few other things we'll get to as we go. Um, all right, so model categories. So let's say I basically have this view here. This is a plan view of the Lever House model, and I want to start kind of prepping it for more of a documentation ready level. Right now, everything, as you can see, kind of has a there's not a lot of hierarchy to the drawing. It's fairly flat and a little bit hard to read. So one thing that we can quickly kind of come in and do, if we wanted to, is, for example, the columns we might want to read as a solid. So I'm going to go down to structural columns. And we're going to do, so there's this projection surface and there's cut. So anything that we're cutting is basically, so in the case of a column, that's where we would want to adjust our setting. If it was a floor, for example, in a plan view, you're usually not cutting through a floor necessarily, so that would, in that case, that would be kind of a projection or a surface. So you might change how if you wanted to, like what your floor might look like or something like that. But for columns, these are cut through. So we might, in this case, just want to do a solid black fill, just so they start to pop and we can start to read the structure a little bit better. And before you hit OK, you can also kind of hit apply here and begin to make sure that the settings that you want are taking place. So that worked. So that's our columns. Now, one thing we might also want to do is our furniture right now is also, we might want that to kind of read a little bit lighter. One kind of quick way to do that is there's this halftone checkbox here. So you can do that and see if that works for you. So that looks pretty good. If I wanted to kind of make that even lighter or darker, I can come into here and start to play around with, maybe I want these lines to be like an even lighter gray or something like that, and maybe really thin. So that made it a little bit lighter. If I wanted to do it that way also, that works. So that's kind of how you would begin to control basic Revit categories and how they would become visible. Another thing that's pretty useful is filters. So let's say for the walls, for example, let's create a couple filters for the walls. Maybe we want these sort of interior partitions to read as like a little bit differently than some of the more structural exterior walls and things like that. So we can create a couple different filters. Before I do that, I'll just show you guys. So like in this wall, for example, this wall family, in order to sort of begin to filter out elements, you basically need some sort of distinguishing parameter that you'll be able to utilize when you create the filter. A good one is usually the type name. So in this case, this wall has a type name, interior 5-inch partition, 2 hour. And then this one, for example, has exterior, so That's one way I could begin to distinguish. This wall here is a concrete wall, so it has concrete in the type name. So for this demo, I'm just going to use the type name as my sort of distinguishing parameter in the filters. So I'm going to come back over to filters, say add. This part's a little bit confusing. I don't know why they have it sort of arranged the way they do, but anyway. So this will be a rule-based filter, edit new. You have to come in and hit the new button here. So I'm going to do interior walls, define rule. Come down, I'm going to check walls. This is the sort of Revit elements that I want to be affected. And I'm going to say, I can leave this for now. So if the wall type name contains, so there's all these options here, you can kind of look at that. So if it contains interior, then I want that to be something that I could parse out. Now we'll make another one here. This will be exterior and core walls maybe. And again, we'll come down and check walls. In this case, I'm going to do an or, and I'm going to say if the type name contains concrete, and I'm going to add one. So this is basically if the type name contains concrete, or if the type name contains exterior, then I want to be able to kind of identify that. So now I can add these rules, and I can begin to apply overrides to that. So if I want my interior walls to have a cut, so I'll do just a solid fill. We'll leave it at that gray. I'll say OK. And then for the exterior and core walls, maybe I want those to read a little bit darker. So again, I'm going to do a solid fill. I'll do these black. OK. Hit apply. Let's see. So that works. So we can come in here and we can see that we made our interior walls kind of this gray, and then the core walls and exterior walls are this black. We might want to take a look at, and this is modeled as an interior wall. Maybe in reality that should probably be a structural wall, and change that to maybe like a concrete, but we'll just leave it for now. Alright, so that's kind of a very quick overview of some of the options that are available in visibility graphics. Another thing I want to show is if you want to, there's a few options for hiding and isolating objects. So if you come to these, actually before I get to that, let me just quickly show these. There's this option here at the bottom for level of detail. So let's say if you wanted your walls to have a little bit more detail on them, you can up that to like a medium or a fine. Based on how the family is modeled, there might not be a difference between medium and fine or medium and core, so that's going to kind of give you, it's all kind of dependent on how the families are set up. So if you wanted to, you can have that. Actually, for this, I kind of like it better if it's coarse, so I'm not having all those lines inside the walls. So let's say the other thing I want to quickly go over is these options here for wireframe, hidden line shaded. So it's fairly self-explanatory. Usually in plan views or sections or elevation, any sort of 2D view, you're going to be using hidden lines. If you're having something a little bit more of like a diagram, you might start to play around with shaded or things like that. But we're going to keep that for hidden lines for now. And that also would come into something you might play around with a little bit more in like a 3D view. Okay, so let's say we wanted to isolate, or there's these glasses down here, so we can temporarily hide or isolate categories. So this is good if you have, actually this is more commonly used, at least the way I've used it, is if you're trying to zoom in on kind of an area and there's a bunch of objects in the way. Let's say, for example, I wanted to kind of get a better view of this revolving door here, for example. So maybe I want to hide all the floors. So I can select a floor and say hide category. Um, and now all those floors are hidden. I can get a little bit better view into that revolving door down there. It's maybe not the best example of how you might use it, but I think you get the idea. And when you're in the temporary hide and isolate mode, you'll notice there's this cyan kind of like window around the screen. So that's how you kind of know. It's helpful in case you kind of forget that you're hiding things, and then you can always bring it back by hitting the reset button. And then you can also isolate objects the same way. So if I wanted to isolate this one element or the category, I can do that. So if I wanted to just see all the columns, I can do that. And then there's also, going back to the plan view, you can also hide elements without that in a non-temporary, so there's like a more of a permanent hide in view here. I tend to shy away from that just because, especially if you're working on a project where you have multiple people collaborating on something, and you go ahead and you like hide this chair or this desk or something, let's say, there's no way someone's going to know that that's hidden unless they come down here and say reveal hidden elements. And that's not really like a natural part of someone's workflow to constantly be checking that this box here. So they might say like, oh, someone must have deleted this, desk by accident. Let me, remodel that, and then you end up having two desks there. So the the permanent hide feature is something I'd just be very cautious about using. Usually, I would say, maybe a good use for it is like once you're kind of really ready, you're done modeling everything and you're kind of ready to just be putting together a set of documents, and maybe there's one little thing that's bothering you that you don't want to see in a plan or a section, then you might go ahead and hide it. Actually, another good example would be here. For example, we have this section that we had made to model the stairs. So this was kind of just more of a process section that we had used so that we could kind of make this multi-story stair object here. Now, let's say as we're setting up our plan, this is not really a section that we wanted to have in our drawing set. We can then come here and hide that section view. So that would actually be a good use for that. Okay, so now that we have that, another thing to quickly show is if you're starting to kind of put together your like a more finalized plan, we might start to, and this video isn't really meant to go too much into annotations, but just to kind of quickly show, we might want to add some room tags here to start to add some information to this model, and then we would also probably want to kind of dimension everything. So maybe I'll start to add some dimensions across this model. So I just hit DI for dimension, and you can kind of go through. I'm not gonna, dimension everything in this video to keep it short, but you can get the idea. You might want to go through, and that will help your plan view become something that looks a little bit more kind of completed. And the goal is for this is to kind of end up with something that looks a little bit like this. This doesn't have the exact settings that I just did, but you can begin to see that this is a lot better than when we started, where we had kind of like this flat line drawing. Now we begin to have some depth and some definition to this plan. And here all the dimensions are kind of that we might want have been drawn. All right, a couple things now that I wanted to show. Actually, one more thing I want to show with the plan. Let's say we have there's like a clear story window in one. Let's just put one in. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to make a window. I actually had already made this. This is just like a window type that's basically 5 foot by a foot. So and it gets inserted at a sill height of 6 feet. So it's kind of like a clear story window. And you'll notice that we can't even see it when we go to place it, and that's because of the view range. So I want to talk about the view range a little bit. So I just placed it even though you don't see it, but if I hover over it, you can see that I placed it. And before I go into how we might begin to see that, I just want to explain the view range. So you'll see here this property here called view range, and if you hit this button down here to show, this is actually super helpful to see, to understand, because this dialog box here could be really confusing. I know I was confused about it for a while when I started trying to understand the different planes and everything. But essentially, the most important thing is your cut plane. So that's basically this line here. So basically you have 1, 2, 3, 4 are kind of what these are here. Um, and kind of the quick explanation is basically anytime you have a view, you just think about that as a camera that's looking down. So you have a camera that's looking down from this cut plane, and it's going to go to the bottom, and basically this view depth is basically, it will kind of show that as like a almost as like a hidden object, basically, if it's something that it could see below. So let's say in this case we're not seeing that clear story window that I just modeled because it's at 6 feet. It's at 6 feet, and so our cut plane's below that. So let's say there's in our view, if you go to plan views, there's what's called a plan region. So this is really useful for kind of tuning views. Actually, I'm going to switch this to a rectangle. So I'm just going to make this section here roughly. I'm hoping that my window that I made falls into this box. And I'm going to say edit the view range, and I'm going to make this cut plane at 6 foot 6 inches. Okay, okay. And so now what that did is that in this particular area of the view, now my cut plane is at 6 foot 6, whereas everywhere else that cut plane is at 4. And then again, this might be something that I might choose to just hide this element in the view so that you don't actually see that box once I'm ready to finalize this drawing. So that's, you know, a useful thing, particularly in buildings where you might have sort of mezzanines and things like that, where there's more changes in levels. You might want to have this ability to kind of shift the height of the cut plane. Alright, so next thing I wanted to go into a little bit was kind of look at some of these things. We'll review what we just did. So let's say we go to this section view, and again we want to maybe say structural frame. So all of our beams, maybe we want to read any cuts through a beam with a solid gray. Okay, and then same thing with floors. Anytime we're cutting through a floor, we might also want to do a solid gray. And we might as well do the same thing with the walls as well. I'll hit apply, so you could begin to see that now we, again, are kind of beginning to add some definition to this drawing. So another thing I wanted to talk about was the graphic display options here. So there's a bunch of things here that might be useful for us. I'm going to skip over some of them. So if you wanted to, actually the shadows is more of one that you might play around with in a plan view. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here so we can kind of see that whole section. Sketchy lines is kind of I generally don't use that because it looks kind of goofy, but if you really want to have something that looks like an architectural sketch, you can kind of add some sketchiness to it, but don't do that. Depth queuing is a really useful one that is in more recent versions of Revit. So show depth, you kind of have to play around with these numbers a little bit. I don't fully understand this. I just know that it has to do with it's kind of like a percentage, I guess, of the depth of your full model. And then the fade limit. So you just play around with these numbers until you get something that you like. But basically what it is anything that's kind of close up where the section is cut is going to be dark, and as you get farther away into that section, things will kind of fade away. So that's a really nice way to add depth to your sections, and probably useful for elevations and things like that as well. There's some things here with lighting. We don't really have any lights set up, so I'm going to skip some of this stuff. Background, if you really wanted to, you can add something like a gradient to your background if you're doing more of like a presentation style drawing. You could bring in your own image. There's also like a Revit sky that's really ugly, but you can play around with that. And I guess that all. You can also kind of have, if you wanted to have a silhouette like lines around your drawing, you can do something like that. If you wanted to play around with the graphics of how that section might read, I tend to not really use that too much. But yeah, I would say out of these things, in terms of particularly for sections and elevations, depth queuing is a really nice one to play around with, and shadows is probably a good one for playing around in like plan views. Um, so that's the display options. And then I guess the other sort of last thing, or a couple more things I want to show. One thing I forgot to mention here is view templates. So view templates are super useful, particularly on projects where you have multiple stories, such as the one that we're working on. So there's a few ways in which you can do it. So let's say in this case we've set up all our visibility graphics, and we have everything, all our filters, and we spent all this time and got it looking really nice. What we can do is view templates. You can create template from the current view. That's usually how I kind of set up a view template, is I get one of the views that I'm working in to a level that I like it, and then I will create a template from that view. So let's just see how we would do that. So I'll say plans, 1/8 inch diagram view, or something like that. I don't know. But now what we can do is, I'm going to just hit OK here. You can go back and make more changes later on, so it's not sort of set in stone at this point. You can always, if I wanted to go back to my visibility graphics and say I want to change the furniture, maybe that was like a little too light and I just kind of want to go back to like a half tone or something like that. I want to clear that. So I can, I can start to play around even after the fact in here. I'm just going to hit OK. Let's go to like a level 3, for example. And so now what we can do in this is, rather than reset up everything that we just did in level 4, we can go and find this view template and apply it. And now it'll kind of do those same settings that we just did. In this case, we also probably want to delete or hide our underlay. So we have that cat underlay. So one thing we might want to do, and we can do this through here as well, is go to imported category, any sort of CAD background. I'm just going to uncheck those so that we don't see them, and hit apply, so that anytime we apply this view template to a view, it won't read any of the imported CAD drawings that we've used as our underlays. So you can see how powerful that is, and you can go and apply that to multiple view templates. The other way to do view templates is to create or apply template properties to current view. You can basically kind of set it up in here directly, and then apply it to the view. So it's just kind of different order of way of doing it, but both of them are more or less the same. Okay, so that's a view template, and that isn't just for plans. Obviously, that you can do the same thing for, if I wanted to, for this short section. If I want to do now, I have that set up. I can create a view template for that section and apply it to the other sections. The last thing I wanted to go through is kind of section boxes. So let's say we have our 3D view here. So there's a few ways in which you can do section boxes. So one is obviously, I think we've talked about this probably in previous videos, but you have your section box, and you can kind of manually slide this around however you need to in order to kind of fit what you're doing. There's a few other really useful ways to use the section box. One, if you right click on this box here and you do orient to view, you can kind of pick any views that you already have set up and basically create a 3D cut view off of that. So we'll see, for example, in a floor plan, if I wanted to do kind of a cut of the level of the floor plan, I can do that here, and now it basically gives me a slice that sort of bounds that level, and I can begin to come in here and play around with some of the view settings in here. There's also, if I wanted to play around with things like shadows, you can start to play around with that as well. So that's a really useful way to kind of cut sections through floors. The other one, and then what you might want to do, what you probably want to do if you're doing this is, I might rename this like 3D level 4 cut or something like that. And now whenever I go to, if I don't have that sort of default 3D view, if I go back to that home button there, it'll kind of create this new 3D view in the curly cube brackets. And so that's, but it'll still save this view that I just made here. So the other way in which you can kind of do a section box is if you, let's say if we wanted to zoom in on a particular area, let's say we want to check out this kind of corner of the courtyard here. There's this selection box. You can also just type BX. And what that will do is whatever you have selected, it'll kind of create a bounding box around that and create a section. It'll sort of make your section box adjust to the size of the object that you're selected. And so this is really good for kind of doing like a 3D sort of axon detail or something like that. So that's a really useful one to know too. So I think that'll about cover sort of an introductory to views and some of the little things here and there. I guess a couple things just to note that as you get more advanced, you would start to look into another way to control visibility settings is through phases. So there's this phasing options down here, and there's all these kind of options for setting up phase filters. That's really useful if you're particularly if you're doing like an adaptive reuse project or something where you're working on an existing building that might have multiple phases, or even if it's a new construction with multiple phases. It's kind of a nice way to begin to sort of add a layer of order to the model. There's also, I mean, in this case we're not doing work sharing, but if you are, there's often what are called work sets, which is another way in which you could begin to kind of have another level of control of visibility settings. And then there's a few other things like design options as well, which are, that's again a more advanced topic. They're really kind of confusing to use, particularly once you're starting. So I would tend to shy away from it until you're a bit more comfortable with the interface and with the program. Because I often, even in professional settings, when I've seen it used, it usually quickly turns into a mess. But the intent is to be able to have multiple iterations of a design. So it is very useful if you use it correctly. It's just very difficult to use it correctly. But it's there. So those are a few of the things that you might kind of, once you're a little bit more comfortable, you might start to look into those types of things. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.